Hello and welcome to another exciting lecture for human sexuality. In this lecture we will be talking about women's long-term mating strategies. So just looking at the things we're going to go through with this set of slides, we're going to look first at asexual versus sexual reproduction. We are then going to transition into parental investment theory, look at what that is and how that applies here. We will look at a general theory of female preferences, especially we'll focus on good genes. We'll look at mate preferences as evolved psychological mechanisms. We'll look at how direct mate preference is for resources and direct is for back to that good genes. We'll talk about that. We'll look at finally an international study of mate preferences, looking at some of the things that even cross-culturally women tend to look for, at least in a long-term partner. Okay, so let's get right into this. First off, we have to kind of set the tone. We have to give a little bit of background to why are we looking at long-term mating preferences. So one thing to consider is, first off, when we look at where preferences are, how preferences work, when it comes to things like dating and relationships, it's not easy. In some ways it is, but in some ways it's very difficult. I always like to post this actual dating profile. This is not a joke. This is an actual dating profile that existed. I'm 5'9", 160 pounds, really buff, muscle left over from the Marine Corps. I'm a fun-loving man looking for a sassy lassie. I have 2 children, but do not need to bring them with me because my ex-wife has them. I do not have any other kids with the other ex-wives, which means I'm free to party with you. In Orlando. So yeah, it should make you laugh because that's pretty absurd. But the point is that there's things within this profile that can be taken into consideration when it comes to mating preferences. There's definitely some things he's doing wrong when you consider it. And once we look at men's long-term preferences, he's actually advertising more towards men's long-term preferences, not women's long-term preferences. But we'll circle back to that. It's just very amusing. The thing is, though, is dating profiles like this sometimes work. Okay, so before we get into women's long-term mating strategies directly, we have to ask ourselves a question. Are males even useful? Why do women have a preference for males? Why do women want males? Obviously we have sexual reproduction, so of course you have to that's where why these preferences are there. But why do we have sexual reproduction versus asexual reproduction? Some species have asexual reproduction. Even some vertebrates have asexual reproduction. So when it comes to things like asexual reproduction versus sexual reproduction, why does sexual reproduction even exist? It's actually something that is very complex to evolve, so why would it have evolved in the first place? And that is because if you've got multiple parents, if you've got 2 parents or more, we haven't gotten to that point with any species on Earth really, but if you've got more than one parent, there are benefits to be had from having genetically diverse offspring, from having offspring that who get genetics from more than one parent. It allows them to adapt to more niches. If you've only got one parent, you're getting basically their exact genetic code. Even with asexual reproduction, it's rarely exactly identical. You've got minor mutations that occur even with asexual, but the point is you're basically identical from generation to generation. So you can only survive and be successful in the same niche that your parent was. And we'll talk about Red Queen theory, that by having multiple parents, it gives you a better resistance to parasites, especially when parasites are evolving as well. And this is what's called the Red Queen theory. Let's actually get into that. So the Red Queen theory. The Red Queen theory comes from Alice in Wonderland, and Alice is talking to the Queen, and she says to the Queen, well, in our country, still panting a little as the Queen and Alice are running along basically side by side, and really not getting anywhere, but they're running along. And Alice says, well, in our country, you generally get to somewhere else. You run to get to somewhere else. If you run very fast for a very long time, as they've been doing. And like I said, in this part of the book, they've been running for very fast for a long time, and they haven't gotten anywhere. They're basically still in the same place. And the Queen says a slow sort of country. Now here you see it takes all the running you can do to stay in the same place. If you want to get somewhere else, you must run at least twice as fast as that. So basically what this is saying is that if you stop running, if you stop moving, you fall behind. You have to just keep going as fast as you can to stay in the same place. So the Red Queen principle when it comes to evolution is continuing development is needed just in order to maintain its fitness relative to the other systems it's co-evolving with. What does that mean? That means that as parasites are evolving, so let's say a disease is evolving, that virus is evolving to take out to infect another species. As that virus is evolving, the species that it infects also has to evolve resistances to it, or eventually that disease will be evolve in such a way that it basically overtakes the thing it's trying to infect. And the same works in the other way. If the thing that it's trying to infect, let's say it's a tree, and the disease is something that infects the tree. If the tree keeps evolving, it gives offspring that become more and more resistant, and the parasite doesn't evolve, then eventually the tree will become completely resistant and the parasite will die out. Good example of this is apples. So there's a fantastic book called The Botany of Desire. The Botany of Desire has 3 main sections. One section is about apples, one section is about potatoes, and one section is about marijuana, weed. Very interesting book. I recommend reading it, but it's talking about how these various different plants have evolved. And with apples, they're really interesting in that almost all apples that we eat today are asexual descendants of one original tree. What apple orchards do, apple farmers do, is they take cuttings from trees and they basically graft them to roots and make a new tree. They don't plant apple seeds. If you ever plant apple seeds and let them grow, you're not going to get apples that are the same as what you get from apple trees. It's just not going to happen. So what it is it's asexual reproduction. However, this has been going on for over 100 years, almost 150 years this has been going on. And what that means is that these apple trees, they are not co-evolving with the parasites that infect them. So if they were left to their own devices, they would actually die off because the parasites would kill them off. The only reasons parasites haven't actually killed the apples off is because apple farmers are putting more and more pesticides and herbicides on the apple trees in order to protect them. So apples you're getting today are just littered with pesticides and herbicides just because that's the only way the apple trees would survive. And this is that Red Queen principle in actuality. Okay, so now let's get to now that we're past that, why there is sexual strategies, or why there is sexual reproduction, so to say. Now let's talk about why different sexual strategies actually exist in the first place. And so what ends up happening is, if we look at it back along the evolutionary line, at some point sexual differentiation started to occur. So you've got two basically identical individuals that start doing sexual reproduction. Early on sexual reproduction would have been from asexual individuals. So two pretty identical individuals. And they start sharing genetic code. And what ends up happening is over time, one of the two would produce a larger gamete. Gamete would be the half of their genetic code that is shared that mixes together. When you look at the sperm and the egg, those are the two gametes. The sperm is the gamete from the males. The egg is the gamete from the females. In species, we actually consider the male to be the one that produces the smaller gamete. So when it comes to the two, how do we tell the difference between males and females? How do we tell the difference along the way? It's because males provide the smaller gamete. There is a few exceptions to this, but it's actually relatively rare. It's the exceptions, not the norm. The norm is that the males provide the smaller gamete. However, we would ask ourselves, why don't animals produce medium-sized gametes and both contribute resources? And what it comes down to is that there's an evolutionary advantage and disadvantage for both large and small gametes. We talked about this in the first lecture, how adaptations always have an advantage and a disadvantage. Well, when you've got gametes like this, there's actually an advantage to the big gametes and an advantage to small gametes. That is that large gametes, such as eggs, they can't move that well. But they have lots of resources in them for that initial pairing to basically feed off from and survive from. So when you first get the gametes come together and form an organism, that organism needs basically support and nourishment to then start replicating and survive. So large gametes like the egg, the advantage is they've got a lot of resources to provide to this initial meeting. However, they've got low mobility because they're so large. Conversely, the smaller gamete, the sperm in this case, have a lot of mobility but don't provide resources. So each one has advantages and disadvantages. So it becomes a trade-off. Since gametes can only do well at one task, mobility or contributing resources, they can't do both at the same time. You get this evolution that occurs to select for these two different specifically specialized gametes. Sperm, which become the fertilization device, and eggs, which become the development device. So this is the start of sex differences. When there's an evolutionary pressure for two different things to occur, these two different things occur, and one of them gives one advantage, one of them gives the other, then those two advantages should come together and basically start the process of sex differences. Well, you kind of understand why two sperm wouldn't work, because even if two sperm could come together and form an organism, they wouldn't provide the resources. Why wouldn't two eggs work? Well, two eggs wouldn't work, at least early on. Later on it becomes two eggs don't work because the egg should favor the sperm, but two eggs wouldn't work because neither of them are mobile. Neither of them can get to the other. And if they're competing with a sperm, the sperm would get to the other egg before the egg would. So larger sperm aren't necessarily better because they can be slower. And we'll come to that later with an argument about that, because there's even more issues here, because sperm are actually different size depending on if they are a sperm that will turn into a male or a female. XY sperm are smaller than XX sperm. So there's definite things that come there, but there's advantages and disadvantages both way. So we'll talk about that when we talk about reproduction later. But now you see this beginning of sex differences. But what then leads to the sex differences greater after this? So this initial sex difference is really interesting. We see that you should see now the need for each. But why then does this translate into bigger sex differences? Do the bigger sex differences, is it just completely coincidental? The answer there is no. All of the sex differences we have that exist between men and women all come back to this original sex difference of gamete size. Let's look at that. So because of this, so males, they provide a smaller initial contribution. They've got these mobile sperm, they've got a smaller initial contribution. Females, on the other hand, have a larger initial contribution. And by the way, when I'm talking about this on this slide, I'm talking about biological male and biological female. We are not to the point in this semester yet where we're going to start talking about gender. We will talk about that in great detail later. For now, when I refer to female, I'm referring to biological female, not gender female. When I'm saying male, I'm referring to biological male, not gender male. So once that initial cost has been made, initial investment, females make a greater investment because they're producing a greater gamete. Additionally, their gamete is less mobile. So especially in species where we've got parental investment, which we'll talk about in a little bit, the female is more likely to continue investing because she is more likely to have already had a greater investment from the beginning, and after that to have to continue to give an investment, which just snowballs into more investment. So this initial decision to keep investing isn't made by a single mother, it's made by natural selection. It produces things later like placentas, mammaries, maternal instincts, all the way down the line that all have evolved from this initial investment that just the evolutionary pressures are there to continue investing a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more, because then after you've already invested a larger amount from the beginning, it is in the mother's best interest, the female's best interest, to make sure that that organism survives. Now, you see species where the mothers don't have much beyond the initial, like in species that lay a lot of eggs, but even in those, they're still doing a little bit more investing than the males are. They are still giving stuff to like where to lay eggs, things like that. So Trivers, who's one of the great evolutionary scientists, he came up with 3 great theories that we will listen to and kind of follow as we go through the evolutionary stuff. But one of his 3 great theories is the theory of parental investment. The next time we talk about Trivers, I'll tell you an interesting story about Trivers. He was a faculty at U of M when one of my colleagues was a grad student there, and just has interesting stories about Trivers. But for now, we'll just talk about this. Then the next time we talk about Trivers, I'll tell you an interesting story about him. So the Trivers theory of parental investment is that basically once that original asymmetry in investment is present, the difference in gamete size that we've got down here, once that initial difference is present, it leads to these differences here. So first, that because of a larger gamete size, you're going to have higher parental investment, higher donations. The lower paternal investment, or the lower gamete size, the lower parental investment and donations. However, because of that, that leads to, on this side, a lower potential reproductive rate. Why? Because if you continue investing resources in a gamete that you've already produced, into that offspring, into the egg, into laying the egg, or having a gestation with the baby in the womb, then having that offspring and taking care of that offspring, you've got lower reproductive rate because you're investing the resources into the offspring you have or are producing and not into new potential offspring. However, in males, as they go up, they've got higher reproductive rate. That is because of that lower investment, they can afford to just keep throwing investment out everywhere. And this is why when you look at it, that males potentially have lots of different matings. On the female side, this should lead to lower levels of sexual activity. Doesn't mean no level of sexual activity, because again, sexual activity is required for reproduction, to pass on genes, so it's strongly selected for. However, females should have a lower level of sexual activity because they've got a lower potential reproduction rate. They've got a lower opportunities to produce gametes and then keep them going. Whereas males should have higher levels of sexual activity. And there's actually a paradox here, because what it ends up happening is some males have higher levels of sexual activity and some males have no sexual activity. We'll come back to that though. But for the males that are sexually active, they tend to have higher levels of sexual activity. Then what ends up happening is you've got a biased operational sex ratio here. What that means is there tends to be fewer males, kind of what I was just talking about, reproducing. Most females reproduce. That is something we know from evolution, from studies, from testing. Most females reproduce. However, fewer males reproduce because of the high levels of sexual activity of those few. What ends up happening, because there's this biased operational sex ratio, that fewer males are able to reproduce and some are at higher levels, what ends up happening is there's more competition for mates, competition to be selected for males. If males have a higher desire for sexual activity, but there's less opportunities, so to say, then the ones that are more fit should be the ones mating more, so there's competition there. That competition is what determines fitness. Whereas females, on the other hand, they do the choosing, they do the selecting. If they are having lower sexual activity and a lower reproductive rate, they should be more choosy in who they have sexual reproduction with, because they've got fewer opportunities for it. I hope that all makes sense. And that leads to this, that the male sex drive, the logic or illogic of the male sex drive, because of these differences in parental investment, not just from the egg, but from on after that, males are often free to pursue additional mates. Females tend to have to keep caring for the young, and we're not talking about humans here, even though this does happen in humans, just to a lesser extent. Females have to take care of the young. Males then are free to pursue other mating opportunities. Because of that, males have a higher sex drive, and they tend to be much less choosy when it comes to mating. They've actually done experiments like the one you see with the sea lion, where the male will come up and mate with just wooden dummies that look like females, because sex drive is so high that they'll mate with just about anything. And we'll talk later about some of the things that come with this. But to finish up here, a female generally has many male suitors, while a male will generally take any mate he can get, at least for short-term relationships. We will talk later about how males do choose long-term relationships, but when it comes to especially short-term relationships, males become much less choosy. Interesting thing from the movie When Harry Met Sally, there's a very interesting conversation that occurs, And Harry says, "You realize, of course, that we could never be friends," when he's talking to Sally. Sally says, "Why not?" He says, "What I'm saying is, and this is not a come on in any way, shape, or form, is that men and women can't be friends because the sex part always gets in the way." She says, "That's not true. I have a number of men friends, and there's no sex involved." And Harry says, "No, you don't." She says, "Yes, I do." "No, you don't." "Yes, I do." He says, "You only think you do." She says, "You say I'm having sex with these men without my knowledge?" He says, "No, what I'm saying is they all want to have sex with you." She says, "They do not." He says, "Do to, do not, do to." She says, "How do you know?" And he says, "Because no male can be friends with a woman that he finds attractive. He always wants to have sex with her." And she says, "So you're saying that a man can be friends with a woman he finds unattractive?" And he says, "No, they pretty much want to nail them too." And this comes back to that, and we should say heterosexual men, specifically, but it comes back to that what I was just saying, that men are much less choosy when it comes to sex partners, and this is true even in humans. There's lots of research on this. Men are much less choosy than women are. It's why when you look at things like Tinder, you see that most women that are interested in using Tinder to find short-term sex, most women have no trouble finding partners. However, for the majority of men who use Tinder, they never find a sex partner on it when they're interested in short term. It is actually only about 10% of 10% of guys on Tinder that get matches. Other than catfish, we're not talking about that. 10% of people, 10% of the guys, so 10% of the guys are getting chosen by the women, whereas most of the women, they don't have any trouble at all finding a partner. And kind of coming back to that, let's look at the sex ratios of and number of potential offspring of the sex differences of men and women. So first on the left here, we've got women. And it's interesting to note that some women, but very few, have no children, at least historically. We're in a modern environment where more and more women are deciding to not have children, but at least historically, most women had at least one child. And then, at least historically, the average amount of children a woman had was about 4 to 5. And very, very few women had more than 8, from 9 on. There are some, but very few. And even at your most extremes, you're getting to about 20 is the maximum. So females have a big limitation on the number of offspring they can produce. There is a cap. For males, there is no actual cap. There is no theoretical cap. That would be a better way to say it. There's an actual cap because there's only so many mating opportunities they can be exposed to. There's only so much mating they can do. But in theory, they could have potentially thousands or tens of thousands of children. And this is actually, there's been documented cases of a few individuals in history who have had that many children. One was a sultan in the Middle East, and I can't remember his name, but he had a very large harem, and he was known to have over 1,000 children. Genghis Khan is another one. Genghis Khan and his children all had many, many, many offspring. His direct children, the first few, had many, many, many offspring. And that was mainly through rape. So we're not talking about the ethical here. We're talking about the actuality is there is this potential to have essentially an unlimited amount of children. And actually, if you did do DNA on those in especially Southeast Asia, but in Asia in general, because it was all the way up into Russia and things, that it's about, the last I heard, it's about 5% of people are a descendant of Genghis Khan. It's because him and his kids had so many offspring. So here's an interesting question. Let's look at reproductive success throughout human evolutionary history. And this kind of goes back to the things I've been saying on the last few slides. When we ask a question that is an interesting question, what percent of our ancestors were women? And it's not a trick question. It is not a trick question, and it is not 50%. You have to think about this from that perspective I was just saying, in that almost all women anyway, reproduce, yet much lower percentage of men reproduce. So what has actually been found, when you look at that then, is that twice as many women as men are our ancestors. That is because, again, males that do have reproductive success tend to have reproductive success with multiple partners. And like I said, 80% of women reproduce, but only 40% of men reproduce. So when I say almost all, I mean 80%. And why is it 80% and not higher? Typically because many of the women died before reproductive age, that type of thing. So like I said, one of those just interesting concepts when it comes to evolution is because some men have a lot of reproductive success and some don't, that what ends up happening is that with more women reproducing than men, even if they're still, it takes both a male and a female each time, but men are reproducing with multiple women, more women than women are reproducing with men. So you get this difference in sex ratio of our ancestors. So we've talked about this, how men compete for women and women choose. And as I kind of already said in the previous lecture, that in humans this is the case, with the exception that men also do choosing and women also do competing. But if you had to look at it, where is the differences? Women do much more competing or choosing than men, and men do much more competing to be chosen than women do. Humans are one of those where, again, both do both, but we do have that difference. So if a woman is being choosy and she is looking for a male for a longer term partner, what should she look for? And not just in a longer term, just in general, what should we look for? And so what she should look for is how a male can help a female. And again, before I get into this, before we talk about this too deeply, I have to say, when these behaviors evolved, we are in an environmental mismatch because our environment now is not the same. When these behaviors evolved, the world was a very different place. And it was a place where men were basically providers, and women were caregivers. So women who get pregnant, they have to raise the offspring. They cannot dedicate the time and the resources to going out and hunting, that type of thing. Men, on the other hand, who weren't having that raise and care for directly, they have it indirectly, but they don't have it directly, they had the luxury of having the time to be able to go out and hunt and provide resources. And it's not just hunting, but it's also providing other resources like building structures, stuff like that. So it comes down to, when a woman is choosy, she should look for how a male can help her be a better caregiver. And the number one thing that a male can do is provide resources. As I just said, provide game, hunting, food, provide shelter, that type of thing. This is theoretically easy. It is theoretically easy, but we will come back to, it's not as easy as it sounds, but it's theoretically easy. It's theoretically easy. A male can just go out, hunt game, go out, build something, at least historically, and they're providing resources. On the other hand, a second thing a male can do to help a female to at least be a better caregiver is provide good genes. What are we talking about when we're talking about good genes? When we're talking about good genes, we are talking about the ability to provide offspring with good enough genetics to survive and reproduce themselves. I talked about this a bit when I talked about the peacock with sexual selection last week, and how that peacock's tail is a sign of good genes, because if they've got it and they're able to survive predators, and they've got it and they're able to resist parasites, then they must have good genetics that will then get passed off down to the offspring. So when we're talking about good genes, we're talking about immunity, as well as other characteristics that will allow them to survive, and other characteristics that will then allow them to be chosen by females when they come of age, if they're a male. And this, on the other hand, is theoretically difficult. It's much harder to provide good genes than it is to provide resources. Because resources, you might be able to buckle down and provide more. Whereas providing good genes, you're stuck with the genes you got. So that gets us to sexual selection theory and how these sexual ornaments evolve. The giant wattles on the sage grouse that you see here, the giant wattles that can be just that serve no real purpose other than a reproductive purpose. And when I say reproductive purpose, I mean a indication. They're indicating to the females to get chosen. And this is where fitness indicator theory is, and it holds that sexual ornaments evolve to indicate the fitness of the male possessing the ornament. So then you have the question of, if females only select a male with the best ornaments, shouldn't all the males in the population soon show the best? Why then is there still male variability if the females are trying to choose a specific thing? And this is another interesting thing to look at when we're looking at this. Why is there still variability if females are all choosing the same thing, the best ornament? Why don't all the males have the best? Well, this comes back to the Red Queen theory and how fitness is a relative concept and how parasites are co-evolving with the species. So male fitness will therefore change each generation. And depending on how the parasites have evolved and changed. And then ornaments are basically an indication of how well that specific individual's genes fit the environment they develop in or are currently in. If peacocks, for instance, there's this genetic pressure to have the biggest tail, to have the brightest tail. However, not all peacocks have the biggest tail and the brightest tail. Even if their parents might have had, their father might have had a big tail, a bright tail. That's how their father got selected, and their father's father all the way back. Why don't they have the biggest tail, the brightest tail? It's because their specific immune system isn't the best for the current environment. Whereas the one with the brightest tail, their immune system is the best for the current environment. They're the most resistant to parasites. So females will then select the one who's got the best tail, the best ornament for the current environment. But then we've got another question. Why don't then males cheat? Why don't they develop fantastic ornaments even if their fitness is weak? I got a funny anecdote here. So you've got a guy here who's saying, I'm the best. Of course I can sell your house. Everybody knows I'm the best agent in New York. I did 87 million in sales last year. And he's talking to you looking just like what you're seeing here. Well, obviously there's indicators that he's trying to show a higher ornament or a fitness than he is. However, The answer of why don't people cheat and show fantastic ornaments even if their fitness is weak? Just like this guy, if he was telling the truth, he'd have a much better car. Because he's poor and he's not telling the truth, he doesn't have a better car. He could only have a better car if he was at least partially telling the truth. I hope that makes sense. That gets us to what's called the handicap principle. And the handicap principle is where in sexual selection, individuals have a strong incentive to lie. However, the only way to communicate true fitness is to do so in a way that competitors that have lower fitness, lower genetics, worse genetics, they can't keep up. You have to basically skirt the line. Like for the peacock, they have to have the biggest tail possible yet still be able to survive. They have to have the brightest tails possible yet still be able to resist parasites. If others are trying to cheat and have a bigger tail than they've got the strength to survive, then they end up getting eaten by predators. If they're trying to show the brightest but they can't resist the parasites, then it just doesn't work. They don't show it. So even though they've got an incentive to cheat, an incentive to lie, the males that have the best fitness are walking that edge that those who don't have fitness can't get to. They're basically giving themselves a handicap so that they're indicating to females that they're good enough even with this handicap. And look at those others over there that they tried to give themselves the same handicap and they didn't make it. The individuals have to prove they can thrive despite it. So I've mentioned the peacock tail a bunch. So the peacock's tail, in a sense, is an unfakeable signal. So the question back is, why don't males cheat? Because they aren't able to. Those that try to cheat end up losing, meaning they end up dying or succumbing to parasites. So one of the fun pieces of evidence for the handicap principle is side-blotch lizards. Side-blotch lizards actually do push-ups to attract mates. They will actually just do push-ups in front of the females, showing that they're strong. They do as many push-ups as they can, showing that they're strong. Where does this handicap come in? Well, what they did is they brought some of these lizards in the lab and induced them to display their push-ups either after running on a treadmill or not. And as you can see here from the left, before running on a treadmill, they could do 10 push-ups. After, they could do 5. So it's showing that once they've had energy taken out of them, that they're doing less. Showing that there's an actual strength thing going on. So those that had been exercised first did fewer push-ups, consistent with the ideas of displays honestly reveal physical condition. A male is doing as many push-ups as they can physically do, and if they've already been exercised, they can't do as many. So let's kind of transition. We're going to now transition into how and why mate preferences work and why we as humans have evolved them. And it's not just humans, it's most species have evolved them. So there's a long evolutionary line, but why do humans have mate preferences? That is because there are thousands of different dimensions of variation. Some of them are consequential. So some of them are irrelevant to mate selection. Some of them are much more important. So when it comes down to things that are selected for, it depends on which ones are important. So considering our EEA, I talked about this word before, but let's look at what EEA is again. EEA is the era of evolutionary adaptiveness. This is the period of time in which these behaviors evolved. What should men want in a long-term romantic partner? We already looked at the main two things, but But even then, what is an indicator of those? So being able to provide resources and having good genes. So humans, at least compared to many species, are unusual in that many, but not all, men provision and provide substantial parental investment. Therefore, women should actually look for long-term partners. In any species in which the men provide parental investment after the initial copulation, women will evolve preferences for seeking out longer-term partnerships with individuals who then provide and continue to provide for offspring after the initial investment. So this kind of goes by to why is there long-term versus just short-term, and this goes to there's long-term because men provide basically provisioning resources and parental care after the initial copulation. So Buss did a international study of mate preferences. There's actually been way more than 37 now, but he did it in 37 different cultures with 10,000 participants. That's insane for number of participants. 33 countries, 6 continents, all over the world this data has been collected from. Looking at 18 characteristics, so not many, but 18 characteristics, and asking how important are these to you when looking for a long-term partner to women. And also ask men, which are important. So there's some where their sex differences aren't present. Actually, for most of them, sex differences aren't present. Mutual attraction and love, personality, health, disposition, kindness, education, sociable, refinement, neatness, wanting children, easygoing, creative, artistic, all of these men and women were about the same in preference for long-term partners. If I'm talking about the ones that they're the same, then there obviously should be ones that they're different. The first is the number one thing that women seek in men is good financial prospects. What do I mean by good financial prospects? This doesn't mean necessarily they have resources or are rich now. It means they've got the potential to have resources or are rich. So cross-culturally, cross-generationally, women value this substantially more than men do. And this comes from self-reports, folk tales, personal advertisements, everything you look back on. This is one of the main things that women are looking for, and men don't necessarily look for this. And again, here I said it's if prospects, not actual resources now. So what is going on there? Why is it not just now? Well, it's because that men who have resources now, who got it in ways that might not have been them doing anything, they might not have resources later. So it's more important to have the potential to gain resources rather than actual resources at hand. You might ask the question, though, is this sex difference due to differential access to resources? So let's examine that. The structural powerlessness hypothesis. This is the hypothesis that women seek mates who have good financial prospects because they are typically excluded from power and access to resources. So what should you do to study this? What should you do to find out if this is true or not? Well, you should do a study where you look at women who have resources and women who don't have resources themselves. So, cross-cultural test. There's been no relationship found between economic equality of men and women and the magnitude of sex differences placed on good financial prospects. So in countries where there is a big difference, where women are fully excluded from power and access to resources, in those countries, women value this the same as in countries where women have access to power and resources. Even within cultures, women with more resources value prospects financial prospects in mates even more, not the opposite. If the structural powerlessness hypothesis was true, women who have good resources value themselves, women who have high-paying jobs, that type of thing, they should actually not care about men who have good financial prospects. The fact of the matter is, though, women who have higher financial prospects themselves seek out men who have even higher financial prospects. And when we do look at men, even men who have fewer resources, men who don't have access to resources or power, they should then themselves seek out women who are high in prospects if the structural powerlessness hypothesis was true. But in actuality, they don't seek out resources in women any more than men with resources do. So all of this basically disproves the structural powerlessness hypothesis when it comes to at least the sex difference in preference for a partner who has good financial prospects. And yes, culture matters. So when we're looking at this here, how much do you value good financial prospects? You see that even in countries like Australia, that women value it lower than the other places. And women in Australia value it about the same as men in Yugoslavia and Zambia. However, in every culture studied, every single one, women still value it higher than men. Even if some cultural differences exist, in every single culture within a culture, women value it more than men. And this is actually mirrored in men. So when I talk about a lot of these, what women are looking for, I'll actually talk about what men then do. And later when we talk about what men are looking for, we'll talk about what women do. So the preference for women have to seek out men with good financial prospects, it should correspond to a preference for men to have good financial prospects, because then they get selected. And what has been found is that it's the desire of most men, not all, to be the breadwinner in a relationship, to have good financial prospects. We get an environmental mismatch here, though, because in today's economy, women are often earning more than their partners. Thus, this evolved preference doesn't fit the current environment, and it does lead to insecurity in men. It doesn't always happen, it's not a universal, but there is evidence in relationship counseling that if the woman makes more than the man because he's unemployed, because of her job, whatever it is, that tends to lead to relationship conflict because of this difference in earning potential. And it's a subconscious thing typically. They're not even aware that this is what's causing the conflict. Next is, in the majority of the 37 cultures studied, pretty much all, women prefer social status, high social status, more important than men did. Well, now we've got to ask our question why. What's going on? Well, it goes back to resources, because those with high social status control the wealth and other resources. It's a simple fact of those who have higher status, those who are the bosses, those who are in charge, they tend to be the ones in control of the resources. So it goes back to the same one as the previous one. Let's look at the next one. Women prefer slightly older men. In all cultures studied, women prefer older men. Roughly 3.5 years older on average. In some cultures, it's up to 10 years for the preference. In some cultures, it's down to about a year. But in all cultures, women prefer older men, and it averages about 3.5 years. Why, though? Why do women prefer older men? Well, with age comes things like resources. Goes back to that. Physical strength and hunting prowess, so it goes back to that. And even things like wisdom and maturity. But then that leads us to another question. Why only 3.5 years? Why shouldn't all women prefer men who are much older, like their 40s or their 50s? Why is the typical preference only 3.5 years? I'll let you think about that for a second. So why only 3.5 years? You might think of various different things, but it's actually a pretty simple answer. It's because older men have a higher risk of dying. Older men could die younger, then they can't take care of the young themselves. Additionally, they may be less compatible for marriage. And if they're less compatible for marriage, they're less likely to have a happy marriage and then raise the offspring together. Another preference that women have is for ambitiousness, ambition and industriousness. And why do women want ambition and industriousness rather than a good time guy who has inherited his money? I already kind of talked about this, but that goes back to what I've already said, and that is a guy who inherited his money doesn't necessarily mean he's going to keep getting money. The money and resources may run out, especially when you're looking at the EEA, when these behaviors evolved, and the resources may just run out, and a lot of them are perishable, so they run out. How about women have a preference for dependability and stability. It is important for both men and women, but in many cultures, women value it more than men do. Why is that the case? Because undependable, unstable men tend to inflict cost on their wives. If they've got addiction, if they're having affairs, if they're being inability to or unwilling to do their work, if they become abusive, things like that, then these are costs that the woman and the children have to take on. So dependability and stability are rated high. The next is, and this is a lower than the rest, but there's this preference for size, physical prowess, masculinity, and health. Why? Because first, it's a cue to intrasexual competition in attaining status. Men who are larger, stronger, more masculine, have better health, they tend to be the ones who have higher status. They can protect the women and children, again, at least when these behaviors evolved. They should have a better ability to hunt. They should have better health, which means they can provide resources and services over the long term and that they're not infectious. That is because size, physical prowess, masculinity, these are all indicators of good health and good immunity. So what are the genetic benefits? Well, kind of one of the things we've been talking about already, that the genetic benefits are they will pass these traits that they have on to their offspring, and their offspring will then have it. Conversely, on the other side, an unhealthy husband is less likely to provide resources over the long term, might transmit diseases that they have to the wife or the children, might pass on genes that make a predisposition to being sick. So there's this strong preference for those who are essentially more of the things that our women consider attractive. That is this physical size, muscles, strength. But why are beauty and health correlated? There's this thing called bilateral symmetry. So bilateral symmetry, if you take your face and cut it in half and put a mirror there, the two sides are mirrored. However, without that there, your two sides should be close to mirrored, but they're not. We've got slight imperfections. And what ends up happening here is these imperfections that are typically due to things like disease, parasites, injuries, things like that, these imperfections in different parts of the face mean that the individual will have less bilateral symmetry. And bilateral symmetry is probably the one of, if not the biggest thing when it comes to values of physical attractiveness, when it comes to facial appearance at least. Those with less bilateral symmetry are rated as less attractive. What's actually interesting is that women, even when only seeing half a face, they will gauge attractiveness about the same as if they see both halves with the low bilateral symmetry. Next, let's talk about a preference for love and commitment. So the conventional women is that romantic love is a recent Western phenomenon. That's just not true. There's evidence for it in most cultures, and studies report that roughly half of adults have experienced it, and there's writings about it going back thousands of years. Most women say they wouldn't marry a man who they did not love, even if he was ideal in every other way. So it is important. However, Buss asked women what are considered acts of love, and they reported giving up relations with others, a sign of commitment. Discussing future marriage and children, another sign of commitment. And giving expensive gifts, again, another sign of commitment. So males giving signs of commitment, long-term commitment, specifically signals of long-term commitment, are considered to be acts of love by women. So you get this there, that it kind of ties it together in that women should have an evolutionary preference for desiring long-term commitment, so then they've evolved this ability when they see signals of long-term commitment that makes them feel as if they're acts of love and there is that love going on. But why does love involve such intense emotions? Well, it's because romantic love honestly signals commitment. It goes back to this, like the handicap hypothesis we were talking about before. True love is difficult to fake. So the love target has to be confident that their partner is committed to the relationship. We've got these co-evolving things going on. Men and women have different preferences. A woman's preference should be to secure a long-term partner. A male's preference may be not for long-term, but actually to engage in a short-term mating opportunity. So the woman should evolve preferences for things that indicate that the male is interested in long-term, not short-term. And that's why these signals of love, these signals of commitment should be difficult to fake, because the woman should be able to detect when fakes are occurring. She should have evolved the ability to detect fakes, going back to the Red Queen hypothesis there. So a study kind of relating to this by Lacera in '94 asked, how attractive is this man? And they showed a picture of a guy vacuuming, and they showed a picture of a guy holding a baby. There was actually more than this. There was a guy alone, a guy vacuuming, a guy child present with no interaction, a guy child present with a positive interaction, and a child present ignoring the child. So the child was crying and reaching up, and the guy was ignoring it. And women were asked, well, how attractive is this guy as a short-term partner or a long-term partner? So if they're looking for a long-term partner, they should be looking for things that are signs of commitment. If they're looking for a short-term partner, not necessarily true. And it should be pointed out, it's the same guys in these, so they were given lots of different pictures, but the same guys did all poses, so they could compare it to ratings with the same guy. So what was the preference? Women had a strong preference. When choosing a long-term partner, the man interacting positively with the child was the most attractive. The man interacting negatively was the least attractive. The man vacuuming was not actually considered attractive either, because the positive interaction with the child was considered to be the act or the sign of commitment. So that was what was considered to be the attractive thing. The positive child interactions actually, though, didn't affect attractiveness in short-term partners. For short-term partners, it was similar across all things. It was more of the man himself, rather than the thing he was doing. So when seeking out a long-term partner, they're looking for a signal of commitment. When seeking out a short-term partner, they're just looking at the guy. They're not looking at what he's doing. When men rated women's attractiveness in a similar context, the ratings were not affected by context. Why not? Well, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that men are not picky, especially when you're looking for short-term. a little bit when you're looking for long-term, but when guys are looking for short-term partners, they are much less picky. The last one we'll talk about here is the preference for similarity. It's a funny picture, but the point is that women have a preference for guys that are similar to themselves. They have a preference for similarity or homogamy. Homogamy means the same. Why? Well, because those of similar mate value will have them with someone who is more likely to remain in the relationship. If they find someone who is much higher mate value than themselves, well, that person's likely to leave the relationship. If they find someone that's much lower mate value than themselves, well, they could have done better. So they feel inadequate. Looking for things like similar social value, a political orientation, religion, ease of decision making, ease of building alliances, ease of raising children. These are all important because they make the relationship smoother. They are more likely then to have a longer term relationship, which means that the male is more likely to keep investing resources into the offspring. However, even with this preference for similarity, homogamy, the one thing that is important is genetic outbreeding, because too similar is not a good thing. But we'll actually talk about this later when we're talking about MHC. The quest does continue. There's lots of other things that women look for in men, things like sense of humor. There's some good research on that. Intelligence, deep voices. A colleague is doing stuff on this, which is really interesting. Odors, and we'll talk about this again when we're talking about MHC. Conversely, women actually have some things that they really dislike. Incest avoidance, so genetic relatives tend to be avoided. So even though they've got that preference for the same, there is things that stop them from preferring something that's to the same. Abusiveness, again, this should be self-explanatory, but to stop the potential to harm to the self and the offspring. Addiction to drugs for the same reason, as well as other things that come down to the same reason. Anything that harms the relationship, that would cause the relationship to dissolve, anything that takes the guy's resources away from the partner and the kids, anything that harms the kids, all of those are things that would be disliked. That is all I got for this set of slides. In the next set of slides, we will talk about men's long-term mating preferences. At the beginning of that, we'll talk about the difference in why men do have long-term mating preferences, and then the week after that, we'll get into men and women's short-term mating preferences. Because even though women do have a preference for long-term, they even have a preference for short-term in cases. Thanks. Come on back.